How's it going, and welcome to No Fun Alloved's guide series on Candlekeep Mysteries, a 5th edition module. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at Xanthoria, a creepy, plaguish tale. But of course, before we get into spreading all sorts of various diseases, I'm going to warn all players, do not watch this as there will be spoilers, but DMs that want that added insight, go ahead and stick around because we have a lot to cover. And here it is, the final of the adventures in this book, the 16th level adventure Xanthoria. So when it comes to high level adventures, you have to throw everything and the kitchen sink at your players in order to challenge them. And I'm here to tell you, if you run this without allowing any sort of long rest, this will be a challenge. And it'll be a fun one at that. Our adventure begins with a plague is spreading all over. Of course, hopefully this isn't hitting too close to home for some people. But essentially what's going on is that there is a zombie plague, and the zombies aren't exactly zombies. What they are doing is they are just moving around and spreading a disease that spreads to other people. This terrible disease causes you to gain levels of exhaustion, and after some point you eventually try and infect other people. It's pretty gnarly stuff, and with a DC 20 Constitution saving throw, it means that almost everybody ever is going to fail this thing. Mostly the commoners, of course. Your PCs at this point, they may have ridiculous saves and may save all the time. But of course, we're trying to save the common people here. So this disease is spreading, and your players need to find the answer. And of course, the answer can be found at Candlekeep. As your players are in Candlekeep, they are going to uncover a book. The guide that is trying to find this is not going to return. Instead, it's going to be someone else. And this person is named Zeleth. Zeleth is going to say, hey, I've got this book here, and reading this, you're going to learn some information. So, of course, if you show off and tell your players what that book looks like, I imagine a lot of people are going to not want to touch that book. And that's understandable, of course. The book looks gnarly, and if they've been safe so far, why the heck would they risk touching this thing? So, what I would recommend is, if your players absolutely refuse to touch the book, then you can just have all of the bullet points of the book description told out by Zeleth here, and it'll work just fine. Make sure that if your players are being cautious, you don't punish them to any sort of degree here. But Zeleth can show off all of the fine details here about how Xanthoria is a druid of Sylvanas, and how Xanthoria is trying to ward herself from death. And according to the book, Xanthoria never discovered the source of the undead incursion that prompted her initial research. But as your players get all of the fun information from the book itself, they learn that the author eventually sunk into madness, and there's a whole bunch of weird scrawlings and writings and all over it. But one of the biggest things can be found there with a DC 20 insight check after reading this book, is that there is some mentions of Mykorgi and Shadakla. And there's also a significant number of 222. These are all in reference to the abyss of the nasty layers that crawl underneath the world, and they are references to Zuktmoy and Jubilex. So there is a lot of course, references to nasty, creepy, crawly oozes and fungi and all that fun stuff. And your players will actually begin to uncover, okay, there's obviously something going on with this druid who tried obtaining lichdom, and there's obviously something going on with this plague that's connected. We need to go to where this book was found, which is in the Lykortha Expanse. After a quick travel montage, your players arrive at the Lykortha Expanse. And it's here where they'll start diving into this dungeon, which is located in this forest. Once they make their way inside, they can see that this place is illuminated with bioluminescent light. There's nasty fungus all about, and there's passageways that they can obviously explore. In this location as well, we can see there that there's Magnus of Zuktmoy. And we have this information here because at several places in this cave, your players may come under the effect of the madness of Zuktmoy, and they will gain one of the following flaws here, which could be pretty detrimental. In Area 1, we have the entrance. As your players make their way inside of here, they'll begin to hear some sobbing. As they move in closer, they may think to themselves, oh, this is going to be creepy or something. But no, thankfully, this is not creepy at all, as they meet a nice little sprite named Thunderwing. Thunderwing is going to immediately latch herself onto the party and say, hey, something bad's going on here, can you please help me out? Now, it's at this part that you absolutely need to have Thunderwing just absolutely be loved by the party. You need to have Thunderwing show off her character. You need to have Thunderwing be absolutely enamoring to the party. You need to have Thunderwing be totally awesome, because the more the party is attached to Thunderwing, the harder the ending of this sad, sad story is going to be. Thunderwing is going to give off some information here in these bullet points about how she used to live here, and Xanthoria did some terrible experiments, and Thunderwing has absolutely no sense of direction, so she's not going to be that much of a help, but she can, of course, provide a certain clues if your players are getting a little lost or stuck or whatever the case may be. What's also really cool to note here is if anybody were to touch Thunderwing, then they will receive nasty visions of all of the horrible stuff that's going on here. And of course, this is where this adventure is really going to start taking its extremely dark turns. Something important to note, though, is Thunderwing cannot be harmed. And of course, why is that? That is because she is a phylactery for Xanthoria. But your players aren't going to know that, and Thunderwing doesn't know it. She is going to keep on doing what she needs to do, just floating around the party and hanging back. And once again, I strongly urge you to have Thunderwing be absolutely characteristic. Have Thunderwing be latched onto the party and have her be absolutely just a character that everyone's going to love, because that's how you get that heart-wrenching finale here. In Area 2, we have the Alchemist Alcove. Your players make their way inside of here, and with a nice little thorough search, they can find a potion of superior healing. Pretty cool. But in addition to that, they'll also find instructions for potions of longevity, which they could theoretically start crafting right now. The ritual takes 1 hour to perform and requires a DC 30 Arcana check. On a success, they get a potion of longevity. However, on a failed check, the potion is created and loses its potency after 10 minutes, and if that check fails by 5 or more, meaning it's a 25 or below, the brewer also ages 4d10 years. So with a DC 30 Arcana check, very few people are actually going to be able to succeed on that, right? Unless you are, expertise in it and you have a high intelligence, it's more than likely that you're going to fail here. So I personally would just not tell anybody what the DC is. I would just say, hey, roll me an Arcana, and then if they drink it right then and there, awesome. Okay, bam, you age. Oh, look at that, you aged 20 years. Oof. Which, actually, depending on the character, that could outright kill them. So, it really depends on the kind of group composition you have there, but that could prove pretty dangerous. In Area 3, we have the Cavern of Souls. As your players walk in here, they'll be able to start hearing some terrible muttering and whispering. And that is coming from 2 commoners that are located inside of here. They are currently just begging and pleading for their lives. And if your players try to go in for the assist, they can try and cut them down, requiring a DC 20 athletic check. And if they fail, then they are subject to 4d8 necrotic damage. And that is when there is going to be some nasty mycelium effect. And also at that time, they're going to be jumped. So first off here for the mycelium effects, we get this D6 table, really a D3 table. But these things are absolutely disgusting. This is, of course, a level 16 adventure, so we need to push our players to the absolute limit here. On a 1 and 2, we get a plus 10 attack is made against somebody, and they will suffer 6d6 plus 3 damage, acid damage. That's, pretty strong. Next up, we have a Spore, which affects a 20-foot radius around, and a DC 16 Constitution saving throw for everybody in there, or they take 10d10 points of poison damage and are poisoned for a whole hour, and if they succeed, then they take half as much damage and are not poisoned. That is also ridiculously strong, because if anybody's poisoned, hey, disadvantage on everything, screw you. And then thirdly, here we get that Psychic Energy Blast, DC 16 Intelligence saving throw, which a lot of people are not great at, and that is 4d12 plus 5 psychic damage and stun for 1 minute. And if that happens during the middle of combat, that is just automatic advantage against everybody that attacks them. That's huge. So not only will your players be potentially hit by one of those mycelium effects, they will also be getting into a fight with all 3 of these fungal servants. One of these fungal servants is statted up as a mummy lord, and the other 2 are statted up as rock. So if they have just come under the effect of one of the mycelium effects, and then they just get jumped immediately, this could prove pretty bad. Of course, they are level 16, so they've got resources to spare. They may have high ACs, they may have high saves and resistances, but every single combat here is going to start wearing and tearing on their resources. In addition to this combat, your players may also think themselves that they need to attack that mycelium. That is honestly a just trap. It's just not a good idea, as the mycelium is a AC of 16 300 HP object and has a damage threshold of 10, meaning that if they only do 9 points, then nothing happens, but if they do 10 points of damage, then something happens. In addition to that, every time the mycelium takes damage, a random effect occurs as determined by the mycelium effects table. So if they are wasting their time attacking this thing, they are just getting their resources drained, as a bunch of those are going to just be doing a whole bunch of damage, and there's not really anything they can do about it. So I would strongly recommend that if they are getting into a fight and they start casting some AoEs, then that is affecting the mycelium, right? So maybe that'll encourage them to not do AoE effects, maybe just try and take on these foes one by one. In addition to that, if they also destroy the mycelium, burning through all 300 HP of it, then once again, they are just absolutely hit hard, as they do get to see cool visions, but each creature in the room must make a DC 16 Wisdom saving throw or take 8 D10 psychic damage. Thunderwing is immune to all of this, of course. So this is just a pretty gnarly room, and this is right there in the beginning. So your players are probably going to be in for a rude awakening of what high-level play truly is like. In Area 4, we have the multi-bedroom. As your players make their way inside of here, eventually they are going to get ambushed. So it doesn't specifically state where this happens, but I would recommend that it happens directly in the middle of the area here, basically past that little lip there. And what happens is, as your players are moving in here, then all of a sudden white vines are going to strike out, and each creature must make a DC 18 Constitution saving throw or fall unconscious. Huge deal, right? Characters who are immune to any effect that would put them to sleep succeed automatically, and any unconscious character is immediately restrained by the vines and takes 12d10 points of piercing damage at the start of each of its turns until it is no longer restrained in this way. But hey, if that wasn't enough, the fact that a whole bunch of people could potentially fall unconscious and just be taking up a Jesus ton of damage, a Death Knight and a Death Tyrant are going to attack the party. This is once again a absolutely monstrous fight, as the Death Knight itself is going to immediately get up in the fight and start hawking some spells or just swinging with a gnarly sword, but that Death Tyrant is disgusting as well. Something important to remember is the Death Tyrant is going to be looking at the party, and there will be no healing to be had at all in this engagement, as the Death Tyrant has the ability to create no healing in the area at all. So during the course of this fight, immediately starts off, some people could fall unconscious, and then everybody that doesn't is going to be now fighting a Death Knight in hand-to-hand combat. And then in the side there's going to be a Death Tyrant that's floating high above, shooting off an eye ray every chance it can get. So this is just an absolute disgusting fight, and I love it. So if some of the characters are grabbed by the vines, then maybe some people will try to attack the object that is emanating out all these vines. They have an AC of 15 with 100 HP, and if with the root is reduced to 0 HP, then the vines release spores into the air as they die. And what's really cool about this is, if anybody gets infected by these things, there's not going to be any immediate effect. However, there will be an effect later on once they fight Xanthoria. So I am here to tell you that this room is an easy TPK if they are not prepared and or they are unlucky. There is the possible chance that literally everybody fails that Constitution saving throw, in which case the party is just going to die, right? There is absolutely no way that if a whole party failed, they're going to survive that. Because at the start of their turn, they're immediately going to take all the damage, and then they're going to be attacked by the Death Knight, who will now have advantage because they are restrained. And of course, all of the nasty, nasty rays coming from the Death Tyrant. There's just no way that a party is going to survive that. But if everybody succeeds, yeah, that's a perfectly fine combat encounter. If they just beat up on the Death Knight, then they turn around and beat up on the Death Tyrant. So long as they're not trying to waste their time trying to heal each other, because there's not going to be any healing here. And also, very importantly, is if people want to run, they could theoretically run, right? They could just run right back through the door and try and funnel the Death Knight, or they could just try and close the door and then the Death Tyrant can't really do anything about it. That's a perfectly valid option. It really just comes down to how your group, mentally operates, right? In Area 5, we have the Fairy Ring. Your players can make their way inside of here, and inside they will see a whole bunch of cool visions of Zuchtmoy. So the thing is if they do see these visions, they get some cool little insight about what's going on here. But in addition to that, they are also inflicted by the badness of Zuktmoy, and thus that's going to potentially harm them because they'll have a nasty flaw now. But hey, you know, visions are pretty cool, right? In Area 6, we have the Flooded Cavern. So what's really cool is in most D&D adventures, there is at some point the common trope of, oh hey, there's a thing of water, does anyone want to drink it? And of course, nowadays, no one's going to want to drink the thing. But what is cool to note here is, yes, the water is not only is it safe to drink, but in addition to that, this room is actually relatively safe. So if your players want to take a short rest in here, they can absolutely do so. I think that's actually a really fun, you know, twist on the whole water in a dungeon routine. In Area 7, we have the kitchen. When your players make their way inside of here, they can see, of course, that this place used to function as a kitchen, but no longer sees any real use. And of course, Thunderwing is going to chime in and say, oh, I miss Xanthoria when she was nice and kind. And your players can get a sense of how possibly homely this place must have been. Must have been a nice, quaint little place. But what is very important here is that located inside on a DC 15 investigation check, they can find a book. And this book is going to show off some of the old writings of the Xanthoria with some sketches of Thunderwing and Bunny Blossom. And if this book is shown to Xanthoria, that could be pretty awesome in the final fight. More on that later. In Area 8, we have the Meditation Cave. This, of course, is just used for some nice, quaint meditation. But if your players start looking around, they could potentially discover with a DC 20 religion check that there is symbols dedicated to Zuktmoy. Anybody that actually recognizes these things have to make a DC 16 charisma saving throw, or else they are afflicted by the madness of Zuktmoy. This is, of course, just hitting on some things that they may have already gone and seen before, but if they are skipping over some areas, then it is possible that this is the first time that they realize that Zuktmoy is involved here. In Area 9, we have the Cove of Experimentation, another extremely deadly area. So in here, your players will walk around and they'll see that the room is covered in a fog that is 2 feet high. And more importantly, they'll also be attacked by some Behirs. The Behirs are clinging to either the ceilings or the walls in here, and they're shooting out a lightning breath. And of course, if the party rushes in, that's going to be a terrible, terrible time. As anybody that enters the fog has to make a DC 16 Constitution saving throw, or they gain 1 level of exhaustion. Huge deal, because of course if they fail several times in a row, they're gonna just be absolutely terrible at their jobs, and if they in fact fail 6 times in a row, they're dead. So if your players are not creative in this engagement and they just rush in and are just immediately getting destroyed by the fog, then Thunderwing could step in and cast a gust of wind to try and help out the party. But I would strongly recommend that you leave it off until you see your players actually try and come up with some solution. Because this is a level 16 adventure, your players should have some resources, some way, somehow that they can deal with a measly little fog in the ground, right? So something important to note here is during this fight with the Behirs, they should be clinging to the ceilings and to the walls because they don't want to be touching the fog, and they should be shooting out their lightning breath as much as possible. But if they do get into combat, this is really scary because, of course, their attacks are pretty disgusting, right? They have the bite, they have the constrict, they have the swallow. But not only do all of those do an immense amount of damage, we also have the added effect that any creature swallowed by any of these Behirs must make a DC 19 Constitution saving throw at the start of the Behir's turn, or they take 8d8 necrotic damage on top of whatever else they are suffering from the swallow here. So that'd be 66 acid damage and then 8d8 necrotic damage. Just a ton of damage being stocked on here. But of course, we need to have these high damage thresholds because your players are level 16 and they probably have resources for days. They got hit dice for days. We need to burn through those resources to have a really fun final encounter. Now, for this combat, I probably would say that the Behirs would be smart enough to cling to this room and not chase after anybody. Because if they do chase after everybody, then they're leaving the safety of the fog area. But go ahead and play it up to your own desires. After dealing with the Behirs, your players can eventually start looking around this place, and they'll see some cages. These cages are filled with the poor victims of Xanthoria, one of which is Bunny Blossom, which, upon seeing this, is going to cause Thunderwing to cry. And it's going to be pretty sad. And another set of visions all throughout, showing off the poor, terrible state of what's going on here. In addition to that, though, there is also a Staff of the Woodlands that can be found in here that is on full charge, which is pretty cool. The Staff of the Woodlands has a ton of versatility that can be used, and if your players are willing to spend the time to attune to it, then they are going to get themselves a pretty awesome reward. In Area 10, we have the Charnel Pit. Once your players make their way inside of here past the long hallway, there they can see that there is a pit that just descends down into the earth. And once your players get close enough, that is when a purple worm is going to leap up out from this hole, and everything is just going to be terrible. As not only are purple worms absolutely disgusting on their own, but also the fact here is as the worm turns, every single turn, and that's on at the end of each character's turn, you are going to roll on this worm effect table here. On a 1, the floor is going to be treated as difficult terrain, meaning that everyone's going to be moving a half movement, and that's going to be a terrible time. On a 2, there is going to be a 30-foot cone that shoots out, and each creature must make a DC 16 con save or take 10d10 points of poison damage and be poisoned for 1 hour. And, just more and more damage being stacked on. If they get poisoned, that's going to suck. On a 3, every single character is going to make a DC 16 dexterity saving throw or be moved 20 feet closer to the pit's edge. And if this movement would cause them to fall down the pit, there is no save, there's no nothing. They just fall right down, and they're going to fall the whole distance 100 feet and take 10d6 points of bludgeoning damage and now be at the bottom of a pit, now face to face with this purple worm. And on a 4, there is no additional effect. So we can see here that this fight can absolutely be terrible for the players if they are, once again, not prepared. If they are unlucky, this is going to be a terrible time, as the purple worm itself is going to potentially kill people. There's going to be a ton of damage being thrown out there outside of their turns. Essentially, this purple worm practically has a legendary actions here, but you don't really get to choose it. So, this is a pretty cool fight, honestly. This is a lot of things going on here. And if they fall to the bottom of the pit, then they have to figure out how to get back up. Just a lot of fun things going on here. And as your players are successful in killing this purple worm, they could potentially find a emerald the size of a halfling's head worth 25,000 gold pieces. Once the worm is dead, a search of the gold yields the enormous gemstone. So, I don't know how many people are willing to carve up a monster in the middle of a dungeon like this. But you could say that if you wanted, this thing just, spits it out or whatever. Or it could just be at the bottom of the pit. Pretty simple stuff. And Area 11, we have Xanthoria's Grove of Horrors. This place is absolutely gnarly. The doors are actually covered in a brown mold, which your players are going to have to navigate somehow. But once they get past it, they can make their way inside. And right as they enter, anybody that was infected from the spores in Area 4 has to make a DC 20 Constitution saving throw or take 50 necrotic damage on a failed save or have as much on a success. So they are constantly getting hit, constantly getting pelted. At the point where they finally go up against Xanthoria, they should probably be low on resources. They could have potentially circumnavigated a bunch of the combats here. They could have just ran past everything. They could have not even fought the Bahirs. It's technically possible, but more than likely, your players are going to bump into at least 1 or 2 combats in this whole engagement. As your players arrive, they're going to arrive and see a terrible scene of a boy being absolutely just turned to dust, essentially, withers away. And the Lichen Lich, Xanthoria, is going to now have an anti-life shell around her. Of course, it's pretty likely that there is going to be a monologue that happens here as your players enter the scene, as they talk with Xanthoria. It's going to become obvious at some point that Xanthoria is clearly mad, and there is no amount of negotiation that will try and fend off whatever the horrible disease that's spreading around the world is. So a combat is going to ensue, and a combat is pretty bad here because, once again, low on resources, but 2, Xanthoria is pretty powerful and she's got some allies to back her up. So once combat is rolled, your players are going to go up against Xanthoria, but in addition to that, they'll also go up against a Treant and a Nalfashni. And also very interesting to note is that there are several Will-O-Wisps that are floating around here, but they won't engage in the combat directly. What they'll do is they'll wait for anybody to drop down to 0 HP, at which point they will just go in and go for the kill. So there is just no holding back here. And now let's go over what the Lichen Lich is like, because this is a unique stat block here. We have all of these layer actions, incredibly huge. The first one being a poisonous spore fills a 10-foot cube within 120 feet, so it's going to be this room. Any creature that enters the cloud for the first time or starts its turn there must make a DC 19 Constitution saving throw or become poisoned until the end of its next turn. That's pretty big. You know, once again, poison's a bad deal because disadvantage on stuff is not good. The second layer action here is the Lich summons forth a Shambling Mound. The Shambling Mounds themselves aren't incredibly dangerous, but they are just adding to the bodies here. They're going to be soaking up hits. They're going to be doing a little bits of damage here. They could be slowing people down, and that's what the Lycan Lich needs, just more time to operate. And lastly, for the layer actions here, we have Rotten Roots are going to spring up in a 20-foot radius centered on a point that are actually going to not even affect the Lich herself. Everyone must make a DC 19 strength saving throw in this difficult terrain, or they will be restrained. As an action, a creature can try and free itself or another creature within reach, doing so with a DC 19 athletics check. So this is just awesome, right? She can control the battlefield, she can slow people down, she can summon things, she can poison people, and that's a huge deal. So let's look at the actual actions itself. We of course have 3 legendary resistances a day. We get the legendary actions, which consist of making an attack, a poison prick, and this is a huge one. The Lich targets 1 poison creature it can see within 30 feet of it. They must succeed on a DC 19 Constitution saving throw or fall unconscious. So if someone just falls unconscious, no save, no nothing, they're stuck there. And it specifically states that they fall unconscious until the poison condition ends on it. So if their poison was only for 1 round, that's not that big of a deal. But if they have a poison on them that lasts a whole hour, then they're out of the fight. There's no getting around it, unless someone heals the poison effect. And lastly, here we have the Sap Life. The Lich targets 1 creature can see within 30 feet. They must make a DC 19 Constitution saving throw or take 2d10 necrotic damage. The Lich regains a number of HP equal to the amount of damage that the creature took. That one's actually not that good. She's probably never going to use that one because it's so incredibly weak. But of course, they're going to be using all these other fun spells here and all these other effects. So the Poisonous Touch here, a +9 to hit. And if they get hit, that's a 5d6 points of damage, and they must succeed on a DC 19 Constitution saving throw, or be poisoned for 1 minute. Huge deal, of course. The target can, however, repeat the saving throw at the end of their turns, and there is also this Wither effect, which is a ranged. That does only 4d6 points of necrotic damage. Not that great. But, of course, one of the big spells that is going to be dropping in here is a Firestorm. Very classic spell, high-level stuff. That Firestorm is going to be pumping out so much damage over time. And, of course, right from the get-go, right in the beginning of this whole engagement, there is an anti-life shell on her, meaning that if people try and run up and do melee with her, that's not going to work. They're going to get within 10 feet of her and then just be rebuffed, and they can't do anything about it. So the fight starts off incredibly not in favor of the party. They're low on resources, they're outnumbered potentially, they're going up against a Lich. It's just bad times all around. But of course, your players can persevere if they're smart enough, if they're strong enough, if they're lucky enough. Also, another really cool thing your players could be doing during this fight is they could show off the Lost Memento. If they show Xanthoria that Lost Memento, that's going to cause her to pause and sort of ponder life and what's going on here. So for a whole round, a whole 1 round, she is not going to do anything. No actions, no legendary actions, no layer actions. And that 1 round could cause them to survive, right? That 1 round of setting up, killing some of the mobs, even pumping damage out on her, that could mean the difference between life and death, which is totally awesome. Also, something important to note about this battlefield is if your players think that they're in way over their heads or they try and get out or whatever, teleporting out of here is not going to work. You can teleport within this space to another space within inside of this room, but you cannot teleport from inside of this room out of this room, and that's really, really bad. So hopefully after a crazy, awesome, epic, massive combat, your players can put the final hit on Xanthoria, at which point she will explode and disappear. But of course, she's not dead forever, she is a Lich. It's at this point your players need to start looking around the area, and there they'll find within all of the notes here that of course the phylactery to Xanthoria is Thunderwing herself. And it's at that point where that should be the gut-wrenching part. That should be the part where your players look around and say, no! Because now your players have to convince Thunderwing to kill herself. That's a really, really sad moment there. Convincing her should be done in roleplay. I don't think that there should be any dice behind it because that's boring. I think it should be, and honestly, a very, very tragic conclusion to this awesome journey. But once your players are able to actually convince her to do it, then she will let go, kissing everybody goodbye, and at which point she will release from the world and finally put Xanthoria to rest. But of course, your players might not be as persuasive, and if they are not, if they just are total D-bags about it, then absolutely have Thunderwing just turn invisible, fly off, and say, no, screw you all. At which point, of course, Xanthoria will return at some point. There's no getting around the subject matter here. This is a pretty dark encounter. Of course, it's not going to be for everybody, but I promise you it is well worth the effort. If you are able to run this successfully and your players fall in love with all of the creatures here, and of course all this terrible stuff happens, it's going to be an absolutely rewarding experience. Hopefully your players are able to get the good ending, as it were, and get Xanthoria out of there, at which point they will emerge as heroes, as all of the evil plague that's spreading around the world will finally come to an end. But of course, if they are not able to destroy Xanthoria, Xanthoria is going to return 1d10 days later, and eventually at that point, just try and set up a new lair somewhere else, and of course continue their reign. Now when it comes to high-level content, this is it. This is how you challenge your players. Not only do you have them go up against ridiculous odds, not only do you have them go up against gnarly forces, but you also give them moral dilemmas. This encounter here, this whole dungeon, is absolutely fantastic. It's going to challenge your players tactically, it's going to challenge your players mentally, and that's what we want to see. This adventure is so fan-freaking-tastic for high-level content. We don't see much high-level content from D&D, and there's a reason for that. It is hard to challenge your players consistently. It is hard to write encounters around it, but this adventure does it extremely well. And I promise you, if you are able to run this successfully, you are going to have an experience that your players are not going to forget anytime soon. So go ahead and tell me, do you think your players are going to raffle stomp all of these encounters left, right, and center? Or do you think that your players are going to get unlucky and some bad things are going to happen to them? Do you think your players are going to explore around and get into a fight with a Death Knight and a Death Tyrant? Or do you think your players are just going to cut right to the chase, go right to the end, and get into that final fight? And will your players actually be able to get the good ending? Or do you think your players are going to be too mean and cause Thunderwing to run away, causing Xanthoria to return? Go ahead and tell me all those things because I want to know. I would love to hear it. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.